the molding or the making of a diamond. As I told you yesterday, is that you put a lump of coal in the core of the earth, and over a process of time and pressure, God creates a diamond. And what God was doing in the life of young Joseph, we find this in the 39th chapter of the book of Genesis, is God was creating a diamond because God had plans for this young man. And that's really the remarkable thing about this story. God chose to put him in the house of this man by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar was a captain of the guard for Pharaoh. He was a man who was very intent, as I see this, in his occupation. And when he found a young man that he could trust the way that he trusted Joseph, I mean, it was amazing. He said everything eventually became under Joseph's hand, both in the house and in the field. And as I have said, God is preparing this young man to make a diamond out of him that he could do great things down the road. But he had to be trained. He had to be tested. And all of these things are happening here in the house of Potiphar, because this was the warm-up for what was to become a man who was second in command to Pharaoh himself, and a man who eventually is going to be responsible for overseeing the resources that's going to feed the world. And it was a magnanimous job. I mean, it was tremendous, the responsibility that was going to lie upon his shoulder, and he's being trained right here in the house of Potiphar, because the scripture says that he not only had the responsibility of the household, but over the fields. He's managing crops, and it's just a beautiful thing to see how that God has his hand upon this young man, making him a person of maturity and life's responsibilities and life's teachings. He's learning, he's growing, but then there's also the testing and the trying. And as I told you last week on the broadcast, John, in his epistle, in the 2nd chapter of 1 John, he tells us all the sins of the world. He says all the sins of the world can be boiled down to 3 root sins: the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. So we talked about last week the pride of life and the lust of the eye. And so here we have a young man who is given so much responsibility. And I believe that as it tells us that he was over the fields as well, that there was crops and there was production going on, buying and selling. And as I said, Joseph could have thought this, well, if I just dip a little money off the top, Potiphar's never going to notice it, because he's not paying any attention to anything. He says the only thing that Potiphar is paying attention to is the food on his plate. But Joseph did not fail in that area. And with all of the authority that he had, he didn't become abusive. He learned how to work with people and to deal with people. God's preparing him. But then comes the lust of the flesh. A woman who literally is throwing herself at him. And he has to deal with this. And of course, that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. It's Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.